creationists.com if you would like to sign up for some of our trips this year. But now I am going to introduce our speaker, Gary Bates. He relocated from Australia to head up the U.S. office of Creation Ministries International as its CEO. He is married to Frances for 39 years. He is on the editorial team for Creation Magazine and which has subscribers in over 110 countries, and is also the producer of CMI's award-winning documentary Evolution Achilles Heel, which is amazing. If you don't have it, get a copy. There's books there, and I don't know, they might have the DVDs too. Okay. Gary has authored or co-authored 7 books on creation versus evolution debate, and is the best known for his books Alien Intrusion, UFOs, and The Evolution Connection, which is the only creation book ever to be on Amazon's top 50 bestseller, and there are books over there and videos as well. It deals with the troubling and growing UFO phenomena from biblical perspective. It has now been made into a major motion picture and has been shown in theaters worldwide. Gary was also awarded an honorary doctorate in creation science from the Whitefield Theological Seminary for specialist research in this area. So let's all give Gary Bates a warm DSA welcome.
Well, thank you, and good morning. Good to see you again. I was here in May last year, I was reminded. Speak in so many places, I confess they all blur into one another, but I knew I was here, I just didn't know when. Like a good husband, I have a wife, and she's actually one of our events managers in the ministry. And so I have the double whammy, guys, of my wife tells me where to go, literally, all the time. So I was asked to speak on Christians, of course, it deals with the alien and UFO subject. And now I'm obviously one of you that's going to deal with the subject of Egypt. Let me make a big statement to you right up front. And you may have read a lot of stuff about Egypt, and of course everybody wants to know who was the Pharaoh of Joseph's time, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, etc. My big statement is I actually don't think it's solvable with the information that we have before us. And part of the reason is I'm going to tell you about Egypt, kind of give you a bit of an Egypt 101 lecture this morning. Now, that's not to say that there might be a few candidates, and I'm going to perhaps pose one at the end, but we're going to learn about Egypt. We have a lot of information, but why is it going to be so difficult for us to solve? So one of the things I get to do with this talk is, touring down the Nile was on my wife and my bucket list. We have an office in South Africa, so I was there in 2013, and I said, hey, while we're in Africa, Africa's a big place. Actually, it took us 10 hours to fly from Cape Town to Cairo. But when we got there, we went down a cruise on the Nile, and of course, as a Christian, lots of Americans, lots of Westerners go there. You've got local Egyptian guides. And of course, everybody thinks that, the Hebrews built the pyramids and so on and so forth, right? So you do that, you're quickly shut down because they're just so used to Westerners saying that, they get irritated. It's a very moderate Muslim country, but they will make statements to you like, there were no slaves in Egypt. Ergo, there were no slaves, therefore slaves did not build the pyramids. The Bible's wrong. And so from that, I found that a bit frustrating, and not knowing much about Egypt, when I got back, I started to, undertake research on the subject. And of course, their dates for Egypt would falsify, as biblical creationists, the dates that we assign for creation and the flood. And so everybody gets to hear those dates. It's rather problematic. But we'll go through it this morning. We're going to do a couple of things. Some of you, I know, are probably familiar with Creation International. If you're not, we do have offices in 7 countries around the world. We employ lots and lots and lots of scientists, arguably, I think, more than any Christian ministry in the world amongst our 7 offices. We go to churches primarily. We go to where Christians are, That's our ministry focus because, as you are well aware, most people think creation a side issue. You've read about the terrible statistics of our youth leaving the church. If you follow CMI, you'll see surveys we've done actually on campuses as to why those young ones leave the church. So when we go to a church on a Sunday morning, we're there because it's full of Christians. And we give a creation talk and try to alert those Christian families, hey, this could be one of your kids. And by creating that awareness, we try to link them with information and materials. The experience shows that most people who've had a bit of information, most children, actually will probably remain in the faith. So our website, creation.com, it's a pretty hard one to remember, isn't it? Has over 12,500 articles on it. Our ministry now is in its 43rd year of operation. And so if you have lots of questions, obviously you can just go to the search engine. We have a free email news called Info Bites, and in a moment we're going to pass around some sign-up sheets if you want to get linked with it. You know, one of the most common questions churches and you and I get when we talk to non-believers is, why does a God of love allow bad things to happen? Right? And even Christians ask that. Well, rather than retreat, and a lot of people say, well, we don't know, but you know, you need to be saved and we'll find out when we get to heaven, which I think is an unsatisfactory answer. I think there's an opportunity. Whenever we have questions, there's an opportunity to give solid answers. So when the earthquake in Haiti happened a few years ago, I wrote this article on our website. And if you're familiar with creation.com, we allow comments at the bottom of our articles. And I was surprised at the number of Christians who wrote in and said, well, we think God judged Haiti because they're a voodoo worshipping nation, for example. See, that doesn't make sense when Christians were killed in Haiti and churches were destroyed, and one of my in the office supported a church where the pastor was killed and over 50 people in the congregation. So from a biblical perspective, we understand we live in a fallen world. It wasn't just Adam and Eve that was cursed in the book of Genesis, was it? The ground was cursed, the plants were cursed. When we see bad things happen, it should be a reminder that something is wrong, etc. So again, you can use, when an email is sent to you, when there's something in the news, you can forward to people, use it for evangelism. Volunteers want to come around now just to save time. If you want to get our free email news, we only need your name, your zip code, that's an Australian code, but your email name, email address, and we'll add you to it. Now, if you want to pass those along the aisles, and when you're finished, if you hold them back, my volunteers will need to get them back off you. So just hold them in the air when you're done, and they'll grab them off you. One of the reasons we're fascinated about Egypt, and why are we dealing with this morning? What's this got to do with creation evolution, you might think? Well, creation evolution's really not so much about science, is it? It's about history. It's about, you know, whether there was a Big Bang 14 billion years ago or whether God spoke creation into existence per Genesis 1:1. Well, Egypt is about history, and the Bible has a lot to say about that history. So in the book of Genesis, Egypt is mentioned 79 times alone. And as the big ticket items are, who are the pharaohs that Joseph interacted with, etc. First 5 books, Egypt's mentioned 291 times. Right? Genesis history talks about Abraham's sojourn there, Joseph settling and his family in Egypt. We've got the book of Exodus. It details the Hebrew interaction with Egypt and, of course, the formation of the nation of Israel. And so, as I said, we're naturally fascinated. Here's the interesting thing, though. All those mentions in the Pentateuch, for example, but Moses never mentions Pharaoh's name. Never mentions it once. Just says Pharaoh. Same with Joseph's Pharaoh. Never mentions Joseph's, the interaction that Joseph had with that Pharaoh. Never mentions that Pharaoh's name. But later on in the Old Testament, we have, you know, Solomon and David mentioning Pharaoh's names. Necho, Tahaka, Shishak, and so on. So why? Why doesn't Moses ever mention Pharaoh's name? Why are we left with this mystery? I do like doing this talk. I haven't very often because it gives me a chance to put in some holiday snaps of the wife and myself. Of course, all for research purposes, right? So you can see the Great Pyramids up in northern Egypt, which is the lower Nile, the delta, closer towards the delta region. These were built in the Old Kingdom dynasty. There we have the Temple of Karnak at Luxor, etc. That's where pharaohs, the kings of Egypt, built on and built on and built on and built on. The largest religious complex in the world, bar none. And it's not one temple, it's a collection of many, many temples there. One temple inside, dedicated to god Amun, you could fit, it's so big, just one temple in, you could fit in 10 European cathedrals, average-sized cathedrals. That's how big it is. So this was built over a long, long period of time, many, many hundreds, possibly even thousands of years. Egypt arguably has more artifacts from ancient history than any ancient civilization in the world, and there's a reason for this. So what we're going to do is, if we can understand Egyptian culture, understand the about life and the afterlife, we can also understand perhaps why there's no mention of the Hebrews in Egypt. There actually isn't. No mention, I believe, in Egyptian writings of the Hebrews in Egypt, but we do see the Hebrews mentioned and Israel mentioned a little bit later in Egyptian history with different pharaohs. But this was once the land was settled, once the conquest had taken place. So they had a preoccupation with the afterlife. We all know that, don't they? We see, great movies on Hollywood makes about the mummy and so on and so forth, but they did. They tried to preserve the bodies for the afterlife, okay? But they have got a religious system based upon this that remained unchanged for nearly 2,000 years. Can you imagine that? You think about the great empires that have come and gone on the earth. The Egyptian culture reigned like this for nearly 2,000 years. It had peaks and troughs, and there were invaders and so on and so forth. Some of these invaders who came in, they didn't abolish the Egyptian religious and political system. They adopted it, installed themselves as pharaohs, etc. So most of what we have in Egypt are temples, not only dedicated to the gods, but temples for the pharaohs. The pharaohs were the mediators between people and the gods. I mean, they had a god of the sky, a god of mummification, and so on and so forth. And his job was to maintain what was called Maat, M-A-A-T. We might transliterate that as a balance between nature, the gods of nature, and the people or his subjects, etc. So what's interesting, to exist in the afterlife, a couple of things had to happen if you were an Egyptian. Your body had to be still maintained and preserved in this life. That's why they mummified you. And your name had to exist. That's why we see hieroglyphics, which are, you'll see in a moment, they're pictured in cartouches. Very, very interesting language. They call them, I think, ideograms. So they're a mixture of pictures, but a way of you phonetically getting to say that person's name. So think about Ramses. We might spell that, and there's a few English ways of spelling it, but typically R-A-M, S-E-S perhaps. We've got vowels in there. They didn't have any vowels. It would be just like R-M-S-S, for example. So a way of really trying to get you to phonetically speak their name, because when you did speak someone's name in this life, that caused them to exist in the next life as well. So your body, your name would be spoken, it had to be written, and your image had to be preserved, hence why they built statues, or you might see paintings of someone. Now, if you were a king and you had a lot of wealth, you could build a funerary complex which would see you through the process of mummification. Then you'd build a big tomb like a pyramid and so on. But if you were poorer, you might have a simple rock-cut tomb, and you might have a wooden coffin, and they might paint your picture on the coffin and maybe write your names on the side. Depending how much money you had was, basically depended upon, how much money was the type of burial that you'd have, etc. And they built on a massive scale, absolutely massive scale. The pyramids, of course, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, the only ones to exist, or the Great Pyramid there at Giza. And of course, they got a beautiful, hot, dry climate. So it ensured good preservation. We even have Egyptian papyri, etc., that have remained. So how pharaohs lived on after their death. So you're looking here at some images there from Deir el-Bahari or Bahari, however you want to say it. This is the temple dedicated to the queen Hatshepsut. She was an 18th century queen, and you can see on the left there the jackal. That's Anubis, the god of mummification, for example. And there is the pharaoh presenting himself to her. That's Ramses III, and here's Hatshepsut. Notice she's got a beard. She installed herself as a pharaoh, and in these depictions gave herself a false beard, etc. She was actually a good queen. She brought lots of wealth to Egypt. She reigned with, as a co-regent with her stepson, Tutmosis III. He was called the Napoleon of Egypt until she reigned in her own right. Now, I'll show you that because even though she went, there's a story there in her temple where she went to the land of Punt, P, and traded with them. They valued spices and incense for their mummification rituals. And she brought back all of this, great booty, etc. And she was lauded for that. But when you see the depictions of the king and the queen that she traded with, they're depicted as being really ugly and grotesque. And their names are never mentioned. They just say the king of Punt or the queen of Punt. Remember why? Well, if their image exists in this life, they would cause them to exist in the next life. And if you mention their name. So the Egyptians believed that they were the chosen people. And when you look at history, and even in the Bible, how people went down to Egypt at times of famine and drought, it's because Egypt was always wealthy. For one major reason, the Nile. The Nile, every year. Okay, longest river in the world, would bring silt down, and when it flooded, it would deposit the silt onto the sides of the river, which they called the Black Lands. And of course, beyond that was the Red Lands, where the Sahara grew, and where Sahara was and nothing grew. But it was so regular and reliable. And so they had lots of gold and lots of minerals, etc., in the land as well. So people went down there, but when they interacted with them, they never mentioned their name. Even the kings they conquered. They might describe someone as the despicable king of the Hittites, but they never mention his name, because to mention his name was to kind of glorify him and make him or help him live in the afterlife. But because the Egyptians were so blessed, they believed they were the special people, but that basically the gods created, they gave them their land, and everybody else was basically second-class citizens. In fact, they had a word, and I can't think of it off the top of my head, for human. And they only used the word for human when they were referring to themselves, Egyptians. They didn't even use that word for other people. That gives you some idea of how they thought about it. So some examples of how they preserve their names and their image. These are the Colossi at Memnon. This is, again, Amenhotep III there. In fact, that temple, there was a temple built there. It was the largest that was ever built, even bigger than Karnak. But they built it on a floodplain. I think they would have known, but it looks like everything got a bit soggy and it collapsed. Here's an idea of these cartouches I'm talking about. This is the cartouche of Ramses II, or Ramses the Great. It's an oval emblem that would record the name of the pharaoh. One of the problems is they had lots of names. Up to 5 might appear in these different cartouches. So when we're trying to translate Egyptian names into ones we understand today, it's difficult because we don't really know what name we might be referring to. So Egyptian history stretches back, they have it to a pre-dynastic or mythical period around about 5000 BC. The first king of United Egypt, and I'll show you a map in a moment so you can get an idea of this, was King Nama, or Menes in Greek, and they even think he could have lived around about 3400 BC. That's when Dynasty 1 allegedly began. Now we're going to go through this. This is important because, as I said, that history would falsify the dates we have in Scripture. These accepted Egyptian dates contradict the biblical dates for creation, circa 4000 BC. I'm not being entirely spot on accurate, or the flood maybe around 2400 BC, etc. And so it's interesting, on our website, occasionally when we write about this stuff, almost guaranteed a Christian will write in and say, well, these dates go back, to 4000 BC. Is it possible that the pyramids could have survived the flood? What do you reckon, Mike? Very interesting. Anybody know what the pyramids are made out of? They're made out of limestone. Limestone is a sedimentary rock. It's formed underwater. When you have a close look at some of the blocks they built the pyramids out of, you'll see little marine organisms in them. And in Cairo, I'm not sure if I have a picture here, but you can actually see the quarry where they got most of it from. It's several hundred feet thick, one great big wall of limestone that they carved it from. So the pyramids actually exist because of the flood. They didn't predate the flood, for example. So the other material they built out of, they used sandstone, another sedimentary rock. Now here's where we get confused. For example, King Khufu, and they believe that's all we've got left of the man that built the largest pyramid, the Great Pyramid of Cheops, or Khufu's pyramid. It's a tiny little statue about this big in the Egyptian Museum. So not much left for that grand builder. But when you see his name, that's called a regnal date there. See that, King Khufu, 2589 to 2566. And of course, we use that convention today, don't we, with our dating systems. We could even look at Queen Elizabeth or Queen, and she'll have regnal dates next to them. Now, we can verify those because we have accurate records. People have lived in them. And when people see that, they presume that we're actually able to specify those exact dates. But the Egyptians themselves, they actually had no dating system. They didn't operate that way. They would just say, King A lived for so many years, and he had a son, and then the king died, and then the son took over. In some cases, there might be a gap. Right? So, for example, look at this guy. This was, I mentioned him before, Tutmosis III. So this is part of the New Kingdom. He expanded Egypt's empire into, the ancient Near East and the Levant, etc. The good reason for that, they were very insular previously. They never really expanded their borders. They were just more obsessed with taking control of the Nile for the reasons I meant before. But just prior to what was this new kingdom, there was a group of foreign invaders who reigned in Egypt called the Hyksos. You may have heard of them. And the local Egyptians were just relegated to central Egypt around an area today called Luxor or Thebes, and then eventually they expelled the Hyksos. So I think what happened is they said, we're not going to tolerate these invaders anymore, let's go and take over their lands. And so that's what they did. He went 17, possibly 18 expeditions into what we now call the Middle East. He set up vassal states there, etc. Now, whenever one of these kings did that, walls of Karnak, they actually listed their treasures. They would actually say, we brought back so much gold, we brought back so many people or slaves and whatever. And in his 17 or so expeditions, he only brought back about 3,000 people, mainly sons and daughters of some of the kings of those lands. He would train them in Egyptian ways and then send them back to rule those lands for him. So this is a lot in when you're not familiar with Egyptian history, and that's why I'm trying to just give you some background, because in the same way as creationists, we deal with the fact that everybody accepts the dates for evolution and the world, and sadly we try to fit those in the Bible. I found they do it here. They look at those secular dates for the kings, and then they try to stretch out maybe biblical history a bit longer to fit it all in. We don't need to do that. So if you can look here, got this early dynastic period, maybe around about 3200 BC. Okay, and that's called the Old Kingdom. A kingdom period was when all of Egypt was united from north to south. One king ruled the whole land. Several times it was broken up. I mentioned the Hyksos. They tended to rule in the north of Egypt, which is the lower Nile, and down in the upper Egypt, southern Egypt, we had the Nubians empires, and then in the middle we had the Egyptians. So there were 3 different kings ruling in the land at the same time. And they all called themselves pharaohs. So when sometimes like this Old Kingdom, when it broke up, the pyramids we're looking at there were built in the 4th dynasty. Not long after that 4th dynasty, Egypt went into decline. A lot of people think that they bankrupted the economy building the pyramids, and then we had all these little local rulers who set themselves up as pharaohs as well. So we got all these different pharaohs, etc. An intermediate period is a time when, again, there was no national ruler over all of the land. It could have been a time of economic collapse, dysfunction in the country, or foreign rulers came in. Then there was a Middle Kingdom. Okay, now these are the conventional dates I'm putting at the side and the alleged dynastic periods. Then we had the second intermediate period, which I mentioned was the Hyksos, which kind of means rulers of foreign lands. And then this period here, the New Kingdom, this was also called the Golden Age of Egypt. From the 18th dynasty onwards, Ahmose, the first king of the 18th dynasty, he got rid of the Hyksos, took over northern Egypt, and then he took over southern Egypt and ruled the Nubians, and this was the wealthiest period. This New Kingdom period is the time that we have the most archaeological artifacts from. You of the Kings, that was built in the New Kingdom period. And then we had a third intermediate late period. The Persians came in and went out for a few years. And then we have these very, very well attested periods here, the Ptolemaic period. So if you know your history, Alexander the Great, on his way to conquering Persia, conquered Egypt. And he left a general there named General Ptolemy. When Alexander died, he had a battle with the Seleucids, another Greek general. They battled for many years, but the Ptolemies adopted Egyptian ways, including incestual marriage, brothers marrying sisters, fathers marrying daughters. That's what the Egyptians did because they believed by marrying your relative, you were keeping the royal bloodline pure. Yeah. Well, one of the things, of course, they did with mummification is we've got their bodies today and they can actually take DNA out of it, and sadly, the Egyptians are full of genetic diseases, the royalty, which you'd expect, wouldn't you? So the average lifespan of an Egyptian royal person was about 40 years. So they weren't doing themselves any good, were they? So a dynasty is usually a family line. Sometimes they were broken up arbitrarily. And then, of course, the last Ptolemy, Cleopatra the 7th, who just gets known as Cleopatra, she dallied with Mark Antony and Caesar, and then the Romans came in and took it over. Here's why I'm showing you this. We know the Roman and Greek dates are very accurate, and we know the Ptolemaic dates are very accurate. There's lots of temples there. There's a little bit of confusion here about this Persian Greek period, but in my opinion, from here all the way through the New Kingdom, I only think we can compress dates maybe a few tens of years. I believe a lot of these dates working backwards are actually quite accurate. And remember, I said we've got more from this period than at any other time of Egyptian history. So keep that in mind as we go on as well. Here's the Valley of the Kings. So, of course, when the Egyptians first started burying their nobles, they buried them in things called mastabas, basically big square blocks on the ground. They may have built them of bricks or blocks, but basically, almost like this little podium I'm standing on. But underneath, they might even have a little elaborate network of tunnels and tombs and so on. But of course, that's pretty easy to rob, isn't it? You just start digging from the side and you can make your way in and you can steal whatever gold and other valuable objects the king was buried with. And then we had the pyramids. I mean, you know, until the Lincoln Cathedral was built in England, I can't remember the date of that, but 16th, 17th century maybe, the Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest object, man-made object in the world. But if anything says rob me, that does, doesn't it? The first pyramid ever built was the Pyramid of Djoser. This is a third dynasty. Remember, I said the Great Pyramids were fourth dynasty. And it was designed by a famous man you've heard in Hollywood lore called Imhotep. Okay? Imhotep is not Joseph. Okay, let me just deal with that. Okay, as some people think. By the time the Hebrews arrived in Egypt, big-scale pyramid building had finished by many hundreds of years. But what Imhotep came up with was an idea to build a mastaba on top of another mastaba, on top of another mastaba. So you have a big block, small block, small block, and that was really the first kind of true pyramid. Later on, they started to build casing stones on them, etc., which we see today. But anyway, Djoser's pyramid, the first kind of true pyramid in Egypt, has 2 miles of underground tunnels underneath it. 2 miles to confuse the tomb robbers. But they didn't do a good job because all of these pyramids, etc., were still robbed. So they went to central Egypt and started to build on the West Bank. And this is the Valley of the Kings. And of course, one of the most famous ones that they ever found there was the tomb of Tutankhamun, a very minor king. But why were they looking for it, even though he was a minor king? Because they had records from the New Kingdom period, very Howard Carter basically said, there's another guy buried here somewhere. But of course, they built these tunnels literally inside of these hills, etc. And you can see the modern staircase that's been built around them. But they're very difficult to find. Sometimes the Egyptians were building them and ended up bumping into somebody else's tunnel, so they didn't keep very, very good records as well. Listen to this, the longest one they found, 650 feet long, cut into the rock. Built by Ramses II. He was building it for his family. He didn't quite finish it. But look at the walls there. Like the temples that we see outside. And by the way, all those pillars and all those columns and all those facades, at one stage they were all brightly coloured and painted. Can you imagine how that must have looked? And in fact, when you go into them, if you look on the underside where they've got some pillars across and some roofs, you can see some of the colouring actually left. But if you want to get an idea, have a look inside the tombs of the valleys of the kings. Look at these passageways. The colours, they look like they were built yesterday because they were inside, hot, dry climate, they're preserved, etc. Now you think the pyramids, obviously, you know, it's an impressive building. I want you to think about the logistics of carving a tunnel out by hand using nothing more than maybe copper, maybe they had bronze by then, chisels. So just imagine, there you are with your workers and you're chiseling away. Can you imagine the dust? And as you got deeper, and what are you doing for lighting? Well, guess what they built? They had little oil lamps made of animal fat. Ever burnt that stuff? Pretty putrid and acrid. Imagine the smoke. And then as you're chipping all these blocks off, there's other workers coming in with baskets and picking it up and taking it all outside. I mean, the dust would have been horrendous. So it was a bit like a death sentence to kind of work on those places. But they did look after the people. They actually built a workers' village nearby called Deir el-Medina. But working for Pharaoh on these projects, that was it. You were never going to do anything else in your life because guess what? After they built them, they covered the entrance over to hide them. So if you were a worker there, you knew where they were. So there was no way you were going to be allowed back out of your village, etc. So here's a little lesson, in case you wonder what I'm talking about. So here is the Nile Delta. Of course, up here we have the great city of Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great. He wanted to make that library, that city, the knowledge of all learning in the world. The Greeks believed they were the oldest, dare I say, race, people on the earth. but so did the Egyptians, so did the Mesopotamians. So there was a bit of a dispute going on at the time, which we shall see. And this is one of the reasons why I think we see Egyptian chronology extended back so far. So the Nile runs all the way down here, southern Egypt. It's a bit confusing, which they call Upper Nile. Here's Luxor, Thebes, the center. And so they've had different capitals at times, Tanis and Memphis up here. But Luxor, Thebes, that became the capital of the New Kingdom. Remember, I just talked about the golden age of Egypt. This is where the Valley of the Kings and Karnak and the Temple of Luxor was built. So how do we specify, how do we know when the kingdom was united? Well, some of the kings depicted themselves like this. See the crown they're wearing? So you've got the Hedjet and the Deshret, and when they were combined, it meant he ruled over a united Egypt, for example. So the upper crown, if you like, there is the white one, the lower, the red one, etc. So how were all these dates derived? So there are some kings' lists in Egypt and some papyri, etc., in museums around the world. And so they were compiled by the pharaohs themselves. But here's the number one source that is still used today. Under either Ptolemy I or Ptolemy II, the Greek pharaohs, they enlisted an Egyptian priest during the Greek time called Manetho. And he compiled Egyptian history into 30 or so dynasties up until the end of Egyptian rule. Sometimes we try to synchronize Egyptian dates. So we might find Egyptian pottery or scarabs in other countries, and they say, well, people think we know the date of those countries, therefore we use that to reconcile Egyptian dates. That's not how it works. Egypt is a linchpin. Even dates they look in the ancient Near East, they use based upon the dates they believe for Egypt. Egypt was often used to date everything else that's around. But if Egypt's wrong, that causes a big problem, doesn't it? If the Egyptian dates are wrong. Here's the number one. I showed you those regnal dates, and people think, well, we've got king here, and we can go back, and we can go back, and we've got a list of all the pharaohs, and we do generally know how long they lived and had a son, and that gives us a long, long lineage of all these dates. That's what Manetho tried to do. But the beginning of Egyptian history in recent years has been a revolution. It's all based upon this. The first dynastic period is pretty much based upon carbon-14 dating. In fact, in the few years that I've been studying this, they've shortened the first dynasty dates by 500 years with the snap of our fingers based upon carbon-14 dating. We know the closer we get to the flood, obviously the more unreliable those carbon dates are going to be for artifacts anyway. And here's another one. To find a date in Egyptian history that they know is concrete, and they look for astronomical fixes. And there's one called the Sothic cycles, which is the rising of the dog star Sirius, etc. There's an article on our site if you want to have a look, but depending upon where you cited it in Egypt can vary it, the rising of it, or your view of the rising of it as well. So I'm going through a kind of a bit of a background here. Here's one of the most comprehensive lists. This is at Abydos or Abydos, and you can see a list of all of these. This was compiled by Seti the first king of the 19th, second king of the 19th dynasty. Now, here's something interesting. In the 18th dynasty, okay, after much turmoil in Egypt, a king rose called Akhenaten. And you might know him, he's known as the heretic king. He tried to change Egypt, which had been worshipping these multitude of gods for over 1,000 years, to worshipping a single deity called the Aten. He basically tried to fire all the priests. He tried to move the capital from Luxor to another place. From his reign, we have all of these Amarna letters, these cuneiform tablets with lots of writings, gives us lots of information. His son was actually called Tutankhaten. But after his father died, the priest got to him and he changed his name to Tutankhamun to worship the god Amun, which was just one of the many gods. He was the principal god of Luxor or Thebes. So Akhenaten is regarded as a heretic king. And his son, because he was his son, unfortunately, also was regarded as that. Remember I mentioned Hatshepsut, the female king? She was 18th dynasty, a few generations before Akhenaten. Again, another subject. I think she's possibly the pharaoh's daughter, and became a pharaoh herself, who drew Moses out of the Nile. If that was the case, we've got what's called memory washing, amnatio memoriae, where you rewrite history as if they didn't exist. And that's what Seti I did, because Akhenaten didn't leave any heirs. One of his generals became the pharaoh, and then his son, Paramasu, or Ramses I, became the first king of the 19th dynasty. So when Seti comes along, he's drawing up a king's list all the way up to the beginning here, but guess who's missing in it? Akhenaten, Hatshepsut, and Tutankhamun, for example. So you can see they played fast and loose with the truth. What was he trying to do? Because it was the beginning of the dynasty, he was trying to legitimize his family's right to rule by linking himself down here way back to the beginning of Egyptian history. But then he's saying within that, well, there are these people like Akhenaten who really didn't deserve to live, and we're not going to record them. So even though we have of information from Egyptian history, okay, remember they're always trying to legitimize themselves as the mediator between the gods and the people. You'll see where they've had battles that have been recorded, and other cultures have recorded those battles, and in some cases, Ramses II fighting against the Hittites, he got out with his tail between his legs. In fact, they ended up recording a peace treaty, the world's first known recorded peace treaty, but if you go to the tombs of Ramses II, you won't hear anything about that. You'll see him there holding the hair of the Hittite king about to slay him, because he's a god. He can't be defeated. So we've got all this information, okay? But they were very selective in how they presented it. Do you remember I mentioned at the beginning there were 291 references of Egypt in the first 5 books of the Bible? Moses never mentions anybody's name. See, if you understand, the reason I'm telling you all this, if you actually understand anything about Egyptian culture, the way they, tried to legitimize themselves, basically through propaganda, elevate themselves, their preoccupation with the death, not leaving anybody's name they didn't like in writings. Actually, would you expect to see a ragtag bunch of slaves who whooped their backsides recorded on the temples of a king who lived at that time? Now, this is not a get-out-of-jail card for biblical history. You wouldn't expect it. As I said, they didn't even record the names of kings they traded with who were friends with them. How much less would you expect to see, somebody when, like the Hebrews, defeat the Pharaoh? And when you think about the plagues were actually... Well, let me go back a step. Let me ask you the question. Do you think that God's battle was with Pharaoh? Read Scripture. His battle was with the gods of Egypt. And all those gods controlled nature. They controlled the blessed land. And so I think, when we see the plagues coming and the Nile turned to blood, it's an assault on the power of the gods of Egypt. That's what it's actually on. Here's the 18th dynasty talking about. So I mentioned this guy, Ahmose. He ejected the Hyksos. Here's Thutmose III. Hatshepsut, she married her half-brother, Thutmose III. He had a son by another wife, Thutmose III. He was the Napoleon of Egypt. And then we have this guy who takes over, Amenhotep II. Here we get to Amenhotep IV, and he changed his name, Amun, after the god Amun, he changed his name to Akhenaten, the sun god, Aten. They worship the single deity, etc. And then we have Tutankhamun, that's the general I mentioned. And then we have Ramses I, Seti II. And here's Ramses II, if you like, the Ramses the Great, the Hollywood Ramses, Yul Brynner. Recap, if I'm confusing you, here we go, early history, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, here's the New Kingdom that we are actually talking about. Because they buried their kings in tombs in the Valley of the Kings, it's very well preserved. If we go back in time, and particularly Manetho's writings, which are used as the standard chronology today, we now know that he recorded overlapping dynasties. So remember I said there could have been pharaohs in the north, in the center, and the south. Instead of them making them contemporaneous with each other, he listed them sequentially. Agenda, because he was trying to fight with the Greeks and the Mesopotamians at the time, saying that, oh, we stretch back longer than any other nation on earth. That's part of Egyptian culture and identity of the Blessed Land. Here's Aten. He had a very famous wife. You'll know this name, Nefertiti. There she is. And look how they portrayed themselves. You know, when you look at Egypt, I showed you some of the statues before. They're always stood here or in this position with the flail, etc., always in a royal, regal pose. Akhenaten comes along, and look at him. He's worshipping in the loving rays of the Aten. And his little children on his lap running around there, they're naked. Just a lovely domestic happy scene. He's kissing his children. And look how he's depicted himself. Wide hips, fat lips. A complete change of style. Broke with all of Egyptian history, the way he depicted himself. He was being realistic. There's Nefertiti, his wife. Why? What happened here? You know, he wrote psalms and love songs to the Aten, almost very similar to the way King David writes to God, etc. Now, he's just regarded as a heretic by others, but I actually think something happened. I don't think he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus, but I think a couple of generations before, his father would certainly probably have been alive, possibly at the time of the Exodus, for dates that I'm advocating. We have these other lists around the world. There's the Turin Kings list in Italy. It's written on the back of a tax roll. So it doesn't kind of give the impression it's a royal document when somebody's grabbed an old tax roll and written on the back. And that's all we have of it, those pieces, basically. It's a representation, etc. Ramses II, Ramses the Great, he reigned for 66 years. He had lots of wives. He had over 80 children. He had the biggest ego probably of anybody, any king in Egypt, because he reigned so long. And he appropriated the statues and temples of other kings and chiseled their cartouches out and put his. That's a pretty awful thing to do. You've just relegated someone to no afterlife. There's the Karnak's Kings list. It's out of sequence. We know there's a little tablet called the Saqqara tablet. 48 out of 58 cartouches can be read there out of order. There's the Palermo stone. It's only recording the 1st to 5th dynasty. So what about this guy Manetho? So as I said, he lived in the 3rd century BC when Egypt was ruled by Greeks. Okay? And he was trying to prove to the Greeks that the Egyptians were the most ancient civilization. We don't have any original writings left. He's referred to by lots of historians at the time, including Berossus here, and also Josephus. Okay? But the way that they recorded some of his writings is disparate with each other as well. So we really, really don't have an accurate record. He Egyptian history into 30 dynasties. They, and I can't overstate this enough, form the basis of Egyptian history we have today. It doesn't include the Ptolemies, etc. He included these mythical pre-dynastic gods. Remember, he's trying to stretch it back as far as he can. And the earliest surviving records to Manetho's Egyptica is in Josephus against Apion. But Josephus records him, as do those other historians, okay, as using nameless oral tradition. Manetho did not fare well with those who wrote about him. In fact, others said that he should be ashamed of himself. He recorded Egyptian history. So as I say, we have no original copies, but other historians of the day make it clear that they believe that he inflated Egyptian history. But to repeat, Manetho's chronologies are the basis of Egyptian history today. What a couple of historians say, Bocoris was competing with Manetho. They were trying to write this history of their own civilizations. And this is recorded. He said, if one carefully examines the underlying chronological lists of events, one will have full confidence that the design of both is false. As both Berossus and Manetho, as I've said before, want to glorify each his own nation, Berossus the Chaldean, Manetho the Egyptian, one can only stand in amazement they were not ashamed to place the beginning of their incredible story each in the same year. And remember I talked about Luxor? Well, it was called Thebes in Greek time. Manetho ruled at a time when the Greeks were in power. Okay, so he was trying to translate Egyptian names into Greek, and then we translate those Greek names into English. Remember I said, what name was he using? Because the Egyptian kings used similar names, for example. So Khufu, right, the Great Pyramid of Giza, in Greek is Cheops. They don't really sound even similar, do they? So they had a Horus name, a Nebti name, and so on and so forth. Which name was he translating from as well? We don't actually know. There's an example of the three great pyramids. Khufu, the father, the son, Khafre, and then we have Menkaure, or Mycineros in Greek, however you want to say it. So one of the greatest Egyptologists in history was Dr. James H. Breasted. And this is what he said about Manetho. He said it was a late, careless and uncritical compilation which can be proven wrong from the contemporary monuments in the vast majority of cases where such monuments survived. So the reason I've told you a lot about those 18th and 19th dynasties, remember I said we've got more from there than any period, we've got the Valley of the Kings, it's all beautifully preserved, and we know more about the 18th and 19th dynasties of Egypt than any other period, but Manetho even got that wrong. Because they hadn't excavated those tombs. So excavating those tombs has only occurred recently. So he was even wrong about those. Now, we do see some interesting synchronizations. Can we look at Egyptian history and determine any period where the Hebrews may have been there or may not? And I could do a whole talk on this. But remember I mentioned Akhenaten? He moved the city, okay? And we have these things called the Amarna letters. And he's receiving information from one of the gates that was set up by Thutmose III and still looked after by Akhenaten's father. One of these kings, called King Rib-Hadar, is writing to Amenhotep III just before Akhenaten, and this is what he writes to him. He said, since your father's return from Sidon, from that time the lands have been joined to the Habaru. What does the Habaru sound like? Yeah. Now that's been rejected in standard chronology because when we look at that period, right, 1388 to 1350, that's prior to the king called Ramses II. And most people have placed Ramses II as the Ramses of the Exodus. That's known as the late Exodus. So therefore, Habaru can't mean Hebrew. Habaru actually means in Egyptian kind of wandering, vagabond, slave-type group, which actually kind of fits them. Now, we know the word Hebrew, in Hebrew, actually has an etymology. So this gives us an indication. By the way, there are hundreds of these letters. and it gives us an indication that the conquest, I believe, is going on, right? That the Hebrews are wandering around and taking charge of the land. Remember I mentioned carbon-14 dating? Have a look at this. This was in a BBC news report. It says, the transformation from a land of disparate farmers into a state ruled by a king. We're talking about the first dynasty. Previous records suggested the pre-dynastic period, a time when groups began to settle along the Nile and so on, was 4000 BC, but new analysis revealed this started much later, maybe 37 or 3600 BC. So based on carbon-14 dating, they've just dropped it by 300 to 400 years. So much for that great list of kings that everybody thinks that proves the dates, right? The Sothic cycles, as I said, they're looking for this rising of the star. There are 6 mentions of rising in the text, but where was it cited from? There's enough latitude difference between Upper and Lower Egypt to throw off these cumulative dates by years. So we've got these lists, we've got Manetho, we've got all of these other sources, and here's what Sir Alan Henderson Gardner, one of the foremost British Egyptologists of the last century, said, when even full use has been made of the King's List, such subsidiary sources have survived. The indispensable dynastic framework of Egyptian history shows lamentable gaps and many a doubtful attribution. What is proudly advertised as Egyptian history is merely a collection of rags and tatters. Now, said that, don't think I'm kind of just throwing it all into the trash can. Not at all. Here's even what something like Wiki, and I don't recommend using Wikipedia as a reference tool, all right, for your Journal of Creation articles, but I'm using just a common, popular layperson encyclopedia. Even they say the creation of chronology of ancient Egypt is a task fraught with problems. The overwhelming majority of Egyptologists agree on the outline and many of the details of a common chronology, but disagreements, either individually or in groups, have resulted in a variety of dates offered for rulers of events. But if you go to and type in, when did King Khufu live? You'll get dates like the one I showed you up there that predate the flood, for example. So why is Egypt so silent about the Hebrews? Moses was raised where? As a prince, if you like, wasn't he? He was raised in the royal household. Okay? Remember I said the Egyptians despised anyone who disrespected them? By the way, here is Ramses killing one of the kings of the Hittites in the Battle of Kadesh. Didn't happen like that. They never mentioned the names of their enemies, even when they recorded victories. So as I said, the Hebrews, probably never mention the Hebrew names or draw anything about them in their writings, okay, because that would cause them to kind of live in the afterlife. You'd be legitimizing them, wouldn't you? But guess Moses was raised as an Egyptian prince. We believe he wrote and compiled the first 5 books of the Bible. I suspect he was doing to them exactly what they would have done to him. I'm not mentioning your name. He was adopting, if you like, maybe that Egyptian way of saying, yeah, I'm not going to mention who you are. And in fact, the name Pharaoh that we see in scriptures, even in the Old Testament, wasn't even started to use as a designation for the king until the 18th dynasty. Pharaoh just means the great house. Prior to that, the Egyptians themselves always referred to their pharaohs as kings. It's only from the 18th dynasty forward. And yet, of course, we're reading in the Old Testament compiled after after Moses compiling it after the Exodus, he's recording them as Pharaoh. So yes, in Egyptian culture, you would not expect to see an underclass or enemy mentioned on tombs or temples that venerated their gods and kings. Remember, to live in the next world, your name and image had to continue in this world. You had to speak their name to give them life, etc. So that's why I believe, as I said, Pharaoh means great house, and it wasn't until sometime in the middle of the 18th dynasty that they started to apply it to a king's name. And even Moses III, the Napoleon of Egypt, when he went and set up all these vassal states, he left all those enemy kings unnamed on his official records. He recorded all of his booty that he brought back, but never the kings named. So Doug Petrovich says, as a Christian Egyptologist, he said, therefore Moses' practice of omitting Pharaoh's throne name next to the dynastic title Pharaoh followed the standard practice of the day in ancient Egypt, not coincidentally the site of his literary training. I kind of like the way he writes that. He says, a skilled writer named Moses, born in Egypt, trained as a prince in all the ways of the royal court of Egypt. He gave the biblical reference for it. There followed the standard practice of the day, leaving unnamed foreign monarch who assumed the role of a dreaded enemy on his own nation, in this case, Israel. So here's a statue of Ramses the Great. Again, you see how he's got that royal pose. They just depicted themselves the same. Akhenaten was quite different. Okay, a lot of people believe that he is the Pharaoh of the Exodus because in Exodus 1:1 they built the Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. If you've seen the Patterns of Evidence DVD number 1, there's where the Hyksos lived, called Avaris in Greek, where Tim Mahoney and the secular archaeologist Marcus Betek say there looks like there lived a group of people under a special kind of state under the Pharaoh. And I believe that to be, like he and many others, believe that's where the Hebrews lived, living under a favourable rule. Remember, they were given the best of the land. I can tell you, an Egyptian pharaoh is not going to do that. And in fact, if you read in the book of Exodus, etc., where Joseph's family come back, and he says, when you talk to Pharaoh, to his brothers, he said, tell them you are shepherders, right? Look after sheep, because shepherders are abominable in the sight of the Egyptians. Why would he be telling his brothers, if he was an Egyptian pharaoh that he was living under, to tell the Egyptian pharaoh you're a shepherder because in his sight you're going to be abominable to him? No. I believe the Hyksos were ruling in Upper Egypt at the time. And then there arose a pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Remember I said Ahmose the first, native Egyptian pharaoh, relegated, paying taxes to the Hyksos. He eventually expelled them. And then, of course, he probably enslaved the Hebrews for a period of time until the Exodus. There's an issue here, and this is another, I believe, of textual updating. Okay, because that land was renamed and built over later, 150 years later, by Ramses the Second. So we know in Scripture that some place names have undergone textual updating to be contemporaneous with the name that place was called at the time of writing. And I believe this is actually what's happened, that the area where the Hebrews lived under the Hyksos called Avaris now is being built over, right? We can see it. Ramses II came in and it became the land of Pi Ramses. So after the Exodus, that would have been the land that they were referring to. We actually get the date of the Exodus from Scripture. It's actually amazing. Here it is in 1 Kings 6:1. In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out from the land, and I'll let you read it, and so on and so on and so forth. So that puts the date of the Exodus. Remember I said we think the New Kingdom dates are fairly accurate? We think we've got a good idea when Ramses II lived. This puts him about 150, possibly 200 years before Ramses II. That's where it puts the Exodus. So Ramses II cannot be the pharaoh of the Exodus. This is called the early Exodus idea. So I'll give you an idea of those dates again. Ramses' 19th dynasty. All right, remember I said all these dates we think are fairly accurate within a few tens of years. The Exodus must have occurred somewhere within the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom. Prior to the 18th dynasty, the Hyksos ruled. All these things kind of fit, etc. Here's another quote by Huber, writing in the Secular Journal of Egyptian History. I'm running out of time, but he's again saying all these chronologies are patched together from disparate sources. You know, one of the things I like about working for Creation Ministries is, even though we're a scientific organisation, we always start with the Bible. Seriously, what does the Bible say? How can we derive our models from Scripture? And I think in a lot of cases, a lot of Christians who've looked at Egypt have kind of gone the other way around a little bit. You know, well, the secular dates, maybe we can squeeze those in there somewhere. So I've said 18th dynasty. You know, in the Bible, it tells us that the Pharaoh that Moses encountered, remember he killed an Egyptian and he had to escape. He went off to the Midian. It tells us in Exodus and in the book of Acts, God speaks to him. He says, those who tried to kill you are now dead. And he was 40 years in the Midian. There are only 2 pharaohs in the whole of the New Kingdom period who reigned for more than 40 years. Ramses II, but he's 200 years too late, and Thutmose III. Thutmose III. Now, one of the assumptions I make is that the only person who could order a death decree on an Egyptian prince, member of the royal household, would be Pharaoh himself. So I think it's fair to assume that maybe we're talking about the Pharaoh died. So Moses comes back and he encounters the son of Thutmose III, all right, which is a guy called Amenhotep II. All right, here we go. There's Thutmose III, Amenhotep II. Okay. Now, interestingly, what else does the Bible say? In the 10th plague, the firstborn of all Egypt died. So the Pharaoh himself, if he was the firstborn son, I think it's fair to presume would have died in the 10th plague. He didn't. Okay, so if Amenhotep II is possibly the Pharaoh of the Exodus, he has to be a second-born son. Guess what he is? His father's dead. Oh, what about Amenhotep II's son? Firstborn son would have died in the first plague. Well, the guy who inherited the throne after Amenhotep II is not his firstborn son either. So looking at the Bible, we try to say, well, we've got a time period I think it happened. Are there any characters that fit the bill? And as I said, only 2 pharaohs who reigned for more than 40 years that I believe Moses encountered, etc. We know that Amenhotep's son did not inherit the throne. There was a stela in between the paws of the great Sphinx. Now, what about Amenhotep? Didn't Pharaoh die in the Red Sea? No. Actually, the Bible doesn't say that. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And he overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. The Hebrew word there, overthrew, is to shake off or brush him away. There's nothing actually in Scripture that says the Pharaoh himself died in the Red Sea. And that's good because later this year, if you know anything, you've been following us, I'm conducting 3 tours of Egypt back to back. So anybody here coming along? There's Mike Ward, he's coming, he's sensible, all right. And guess what, Mike? We're going to see Amenhotep II's tomb, his mummy, in the mummy room of the Egyptian Museum. I want you to think about what it might be like to actually stand there and ponder when you look at his mummified face and say, my goodness, this could actually be the Pharaoh that Moses encountered during the Exodus. Now, having said all of that, we don't know. But one thing is very interesting. His father, who conducted 17 military campaigns and brought back all this wealth, only brought back about 2,300 prisoners. His son only conducted a maximum of 3 campaigns and brought back 101,000 slaves. Why was his focus bringing back people? Well, perhaps he just lost a good portion of his workforce during the Exodus, etc. And in the Amarna letters, right, 1 generation after Amenhotep II, we have the Hebrews or the Abaru wandering in the land, etc. Moses III, his stepmother was Hatshepsut. Remember I said she may have been the one who drew Moses from the Nile, and guess what? She was erased from history in the King's List. When you go to Ger, Amenhotep II, interestingly, has chiseled her face on monuments and tried to destroy them. Why do you think he was doing that, perhaps? Well, who's he blaming for raising Moses, etc. So anyway, I've run out of time, but lots and lots of information there. We're going to do a couple of things. We want you to obviously to sign up for the Creation magazine. I know a lot of you get it, but have a break. This is the type of stuff that you get in there when we make new finds. We talk about things like radiometric dating and how we use radiometric dating to falsify secular dates. We're starting to do that even with things like Egypt.